Our 15th lesson looks at progressivism at the local level. This is an incredibly important topic because if you want to understand progressivism and how it works, you have to understand firstly that very much unlike the top-down approach, the movement known as the progressives and the success they have that gets really its start at the local level. From successes in particular cities and states, it starts to branch out. People see that change can happen, and they start to adopt the approaches and the ideas of some of the pioneering governors and representatives at the local level. And let's start walking through a few of the things that they did. Now, the term local in this context, it's important to remember, talks about the influence on the politics and management of smaller government bodies. Number one, we're talking about city government. And number two, we're talking about state government. The progressives in this respect will score some of their most impressive gains in the cities. As we remember, the progressives are angered at particular things that would involve cities. Number one, inefficiency. The police and the fire services that were not coordinated, also corrupt. Secondly, of course, the massive corruption of city government. The party machines like the famous Democratic machine, Tammany Hall, which put up bosses like the famous Boss Tweed or Boss Platt of New York City, who ran the city on a system of corruption, exploiting the new immigrants, providing services, but always in exchange for votes, led to a lot of people being really angry. Now, progressives and the impact on the states. Every state in the USA has its own governor and its own legislature. Therefore, because this is a decentralized federal system, it's entitled under the Constitution to pass its own laws in areas that the Constitution allows it for. And in many ways, state governments, as you're probably well aware, are much more powerful than the federal government over the direct day-to-day lives of its people. But by 1900, many progressive states, predominantly in the West, and I'll get to that in a moment, were passing laws in areas such as consumer protection, the restriction of working hours. Congress then follows and applies this to the whole of the United States. Some pass laws in an effort to break party bosses, to give their state a much more democratic system of government. Others do it just to deal with particular problems that they're having at the local level. Now, what we have, and really the champions of the progressive movement, and it'd be wrong to say that, oh yes, the only progressives are the three major presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. What you have to understand from a more comprehensive view of the progressive movement is that the progressive movement is very much as much championed by the big guys who come in actually a little bit later as it was by the little guys, the little big men, as I call them, such as the Republican governor of Wisconsin, Robert LaFollette, Fighting Bob LaFollette, as I used to call him. He created what's known as, or what becomes known as the Wisconsin idea, which is really a progressive idea, the idea that they're going to take on the vested interests in business, especially the railroads. They're going to break railroads trusts to reduce fares. Other things that included in the Wisconsin idea are changing the way people are elected to both state and local governments to ensure that the party bosses who had always rigged elections, to ensure that the people who kept the chain of corruption going became the next generation of politicians, to break this by introducing new ways of electing politicians. A couple other ones, you've got the Republican Charles Evans Hughes, who was governor of New York. You also have the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, who would become the third progressive president of the United States in 1912. He becomes a champion of many types of reform, including breaking the corruption of the boss system in New Jersey, where he happened to be the governor. He also talks about things like welfare reform and pensions and establishing the role of the women, et cetera, et cetera. Now, anyways, much of their work gets concerned with breaking the powers of the vested interest. And I would say that the biggest contribution at the local level is changing the way states elect their officials in order to break that sort of boss system. Their methods are varied. Now, there's no consistency in these methods, as very much as needs to be understood is that what works in Wisconsin can be applied in other areas, but it also is tinkered with in many ways. So their methods are varied, but in a lot of cases, they're copied across the entire United States by the early part of the 20th century. Let's take a look at a few of these. One of the first and best examples of local level initiatives that are incredibly important regarding the administration of cities is the creation of what's known as the Commission and City Manager. In 1901, the city of Galveston, Texas, in southeastern Texas, appoints effectively an expert staff commission to run the cities. The cities before, of course, had all been run by elected officials. These elected officials were massively corrupt. And as a result, they got rid of the elected officials running the city and they appointed a number of experts. If they had a transport department, they put the transport commissioner, a person who's an expert in transport. All of these things tend to make sense. And what that means is that the administration of the city, the actual running of the city, is taken out of the hands of the politicians, and therefore the corruption that came with that, and the boss system that was predominantly running throughout the United States, could be broken in this respect. Now, this also makes it more efficient. Okay, it ensures that all of the people, all of the regions of the city got equal services, not just those who voted the right way. Because what would happen if it was run by the party bosses is you would get very good policing in the areas of the city that supported that boss. However, policing would be very poor in areas that didn't. Or certain areas would have to pay much more higher taxes, for instance, and receive less services because the boss didn't like them, because they, I don't know, supported the other guy, for instance. Another important consideration, though, is the fact that in the city manager system, the idea that instead of a mayor running the city, they're going to have one overall city manager generally appointed or beholden to the commission, is that this whole idea of both the commission and the city manager achieve one aim of the progressives, which is to break corruption. But the other aim, and sadly, is that you sacrifice democracy. Now, we can argue that the bosses weren't necessarily democratic, and that might be true, but at least people did vote for them. So one of the trade-offs that the progressives make, and I guess one criticism, if you will, of this system, is the fact that this is actually less democratic. People aren't necessarily voting for their city officials anymore. They're all effectively appointed, and you get a very, let's say, powerful clique of commissionaires. Themselves eventually can be beholden to corruption, but at least in the short term, this very much works. So this is a good example of both the success, but also the limits of progressive politics. A couple other things I want. The initiative in the referendum. If you study American politics at A level, you may realize that the initiative and referendum are two ways that citizens can have an impact on the government. Both of these two things are used in the western state of South Dakota in 1898, and they allow voters to have a direct say in proposing a particular law. And they work like this. Now, if you want an initiative put forward, you need to get 10% of the eligible voters to sign a petition. Once 10% of the eligible voters sign a petition, the state legislature is then forced to vote on a law for approval. And if the state legislature passes it, it can become law. Now, you may be saying, well, if the state legislature is corrupt, they're never going to vote for it. But put it this way, if you put it up enough times, eventually the state legislature will have to be somewhat beholden to the people. So it's a good way of pressuring government, even if you're not successful the first time, into getting laws passed that are benefit to, let's just say, a larger majority of the people. The referendum, okay, is something that it's basically where you hold or let's just say questions that the state needs answered instead of being dealt in the legislature can be put out to the people. 50% of the people who vote for the particular proposal, then the proposal therefore becomes law, regardless of what the state legislature thinks. Another one is called the recall. The recall is first used in California in 1903 in the city of Los Angeles. It's actually most recently used in California. If you want to talk about the recall election of Governor Gray Davis only a few years back. The recall election allows for the removal of an office holder before his or her term has expired. Now, this is a way that people who are unhappy with their elected officials can, if they have a petition signed with 25% of the eligible voters, move to have a vote, okay, to start the process of removing an elected official. This is known as the recall. And the recall is a powerful way to keep elected officials from acting outside of the interests of the people. One of the biggest changes, and this is something pioneered by Fighting Bob LaFollette of Wisconsin, and fundamental to the Wisconsin idea, which takes really is probably the most powerful impact at the lower level of state politics, is what's known as a direct primary. Up until this point, the candidates for elections had traditionally been pre-selected by the party bosses. They've been known well in advance. They would use a nominating convention where all of the delegates get together to impose their will and influence and to ensure that their man got selected as the next person to run in the election. La obviously saw the problems with this and wanted to break the power of the party bosses. Therefore, he institutes what's known as a direct primary. And a primary is a preliminary election. Think of it as an election before an election, which all voters can nominate directly the candidate they would like to see run for their party in the general election to follow. And you can, instead of having to vote for the guy the party bosses put up, vote for the guy you want to run for your particular party. The direct primary system is widely accepted. The overwhelming majority of the United States use a form of the direct primary today. Some use a sort of what do they call it? I forgot, the name escapes me. Basically, a caucus, if you will. Some use a caucus, which is very much similar to a direct primary, but ultimately the whole idea is the same. The people select the candidates, and this is a phenomenally important move that breaks the power and corruption of the elected officials and the party bosses. The direct election of senators. The United States, the bicameral nature of their legislature means that they have two levels of government. You have the president, you have the Senate and the House of Representatives below it, and that is in sort of the legislative branch of government. Up until the time of the Progressive era, the senators, who have an overwhelming power to veto or outvote a law passed in the House of Representatives, because all laws have to go through both houses before they become law. These people had not been elected. They had been nominated by their state legislatures, a practice effectively that had led to charges of influence and election rigging and corruption and so on and so forth. And as a result, states start to pass laws which introduce popular elections to determine who the voters want as their senatorial candidate, which legislatures had to eventually accept. This leads to, by 1913, the passing of the 17th Amendment, which is a major progressive achievement. And this requires a direct election of all senators. And it's a good example of how a reform adopted at the federal level, which had its origins in the actions of the states, because this is something that happens in sort of the small time and then gets sort of then of course escalates and becomes a national law. Other things that they want, women's suffrage. Women are phenomenally important to the progressive movement, and you're going to have to pay particular attention to how women, both at the state, local, and federal level, influence politics. Women are demanding, among other things, but more particularly and more vociferously at this particular point, the passage of an amendment to the Constitution which will grant nationwide female suffrage. In 1880, there was a Supreme Court case where women had brought forth the idea that if we are equal citizens under the law according to the Constitution, then we need all equality. And the Supreme Court actually strikes it down. And he said that yes, in fact, women were equal, but that equality didn't extend to voting, which is a pretty interesting view of the law. Anyhow, make a long story short, Wyoming really leads the push. Wyoming is a Western state. It's the first state to pass women's suffrage laws. 8 other states will follow by 1913. And where you have, all in the West particularly, a movement generated by women, which is allowing women to vote for the first time. And of course, this will become a major issue throughout the Progressive era and eventually lead to the passing of the 19th Amendment, which grants nationwide female suffrage. One of the interesting reasons, and it's very important to note at this point, that one of the reasons the West is so much more progressive than the East has to do with the sort of the spirit of the West, if you will. On the frontier, at the edges of America, women and men don't operate in their spheres, their traditional spheres, very much like they would in the European context or in the Eastern American context, where women's place is in the home, rearing the children. Out in the west of the frontier, women and men are needed equally to do all things, such as farm, grow crops, tend to animals, raise the children. Women and men sort of intermingle almost as equals, not to say that they're totally equal, but much more equal than they are. Sort of their spheres are, let's just say their spheres are melding much more equally than they are in the East at this particular time. And it's actually, if you think of the fact that women are doing all of the things that men, is a natural next step to say, well, then why not give women the right to vote? If a woman can ride a horse and herd cattle, then she can probably choose her elected official. So it makes sense that Western states really need this. And women's suffrage is a movement that grows very strong in the West and eventually moves east and becoming a national movement. By 1919, of course, it achieves nationwide female suffrage. Welfare reform. This is something championed by Wilson in New Jersey, but also local progressives, not just in New Jersey, are concerned about some of the major issues here. We have the ideas of some slum clearance in the cities to remove the horrors of the tenements. Um, Development of better services such as education and leisure facilities and dealing with urban growth. Improvements in employment legislation, especially for women and children over issues such as hours and wages. Health and safety standards at work, and basic welfare for widows, orphans, and the destitute. These are things that didn't exist in the Gilded Age, but become predominantly local level major issues of progressive politicians and will start to take place. You see the end of tenement dwellings. There's rulings in the 1890s around the turn of the century that, for instance, all houses in New York need to have plumbing and indoor toilets, which of course weren't necessarily the case up until that point, as one example. One of the probably the biggest impacts that they have to do with health and safety for workers. Okay, workers working in horrendously unsafe conditions, children working in unsafe conditions. These things are targeted. They're relatively easy fixes because you can pass easy legislation to prevent it, but at the same time, they make a great difference. The fact that the exploitation of the working class is limited to some degree, anyhow, at this particular point. And the last point of it all is the urban reform of the slums. Now, as I sort of mentioned earlier, urban reforms attacking the slumlords, the tenement lords, attacking things like juvenile delinquency, criminality amongst young people who aren't in school, and wide open prostitution, oftentimes known as, colloquially referred to at the time as vice at a price. Um, these become the targets of progressives. You got to remember that middle class values very much are Christian values, the white Christian values, and things like prostitution, more particularly, which flourish in cities, red light districts, and areas of ill repute. Um, are seen as sort of vices which can and must be easily controlled for the betterment of society. You have corrupt businessmen running them, so it touches that. You also have criminals running them. You have the bribery and corruption of police, because most of these people had bribed the police to turn an eye. Now, Americans had looked to the English and German cities for lessons on how to clean up their water supplies additionally, to how to light their streets, how to run their trolley cars. And what we see is sort of as a result of local level reforms, the first real, let's just say, well-functioning public utilities. Many cities will go so far as purchasing back their public utilities. The laissez-faire nature of government, of course, meant that most public utilities were owned by rich barons, in effect. And cities realized that these barons were not only corrupt, but they were driving up prices and making basic necessities of life unaffordable for most Americans. So cities will buy back their utilities during this time from private owners. Really, there's a whole wave of this. It sweeps the nation. The idea that cities need to be in charge of their transport, cities need to be in charge of their water, and they should be run efficiently and for the betterment of the people by city managers or the commissions, et cetera, et cetera. So you get cities all over the country buying back, usually much to the profit benefit of the person who originally owned it, but nevertheless, things like their water and electric supplies. And what this all means is that the mayors and the bosses who had run corrupt the cities and corrupt who would for instance give contracts for kickbacks, which is bags of money in exchange for access to all of the right to light this particular area of the city with your electrical company. These types of things are ended because cities automatically start to get involved in the urban reform of slums. So as we can see, tremendous change in the progressive era. A lot of it originated at the local level. We'll see how this impacts on federal reform and why, by comparison, the push for, let's just say, federal uh, progressive steps up until that is, of course, the major implementations of Wilson, Taft, and Roosevelt, why the federal government reacts quite a bit more slowly than they do in the local level. But that's for next lesson.